show started. But what I do is, whoop, as if like I've caught you off guard. Like, as the world's worst ninja. Can't sneak up on anyone when everybody's like, whoop. Right, you might have heard that there was this little thing called Transformers that came out around 1984. So that means that I've been reliably informed, because my maths is terrible, that this year is the 40th anniversary of Transformers! And so for a lot of us, especially here in the UK, there was a divide. There was people who grew up reading the comic books, and there were people like me who grew up watching, rewatching, much to my parents' chagrin, time and time again, the same episodes, because we only had about 3 or 4 on VHS. It was the dark times before you could actually get anything. But we were absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome our first guest up on stage. Not only was he one of the producers on season 3 of Transformers, but he wrote some of the best episodes, including Starscream's Brigade, the first introduction of the Combat Class. The Return of Optimus Prime Part 2, which we're going to be doing on Sunday morning, by the way. So please put your hands together, give a massive round of applause to Michael Charles Hill!
Yes, I am.
Excellent. So what we thought we would do, and I love this because I'm a big fan of audio commentary, because it's always good to pick people's brains whenever they're watching something, that we would sit down and chill out for a little bit, have a bit of a Saturday morning, even though it's Friday, I know, Saturday morning cartoon session and just watch some Transformers while you and I, hopefully more you, are those the pre-prepared notes? I like it. I like it. I like it.
I have not seen either of these episodes since they first aired. And there was a part of me that wanted to just wing it, but I felt it wouldn't be fair not to be a little prepared. As painful as it was for me to rewatch them the other day.
Now, just before people that is absolutely a rightless thing, isn't it? It's just never being satisfied with what you're right. Yeah. Okay, shall we cue up the gambler then? Sing it if you know it.
Raise their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons.
You're all terrible at karaoke. Right, so Michael, here we are with the gambler. Right, first thing, right off the bat, let's talk a little bit about the introduction here. We talked about this before. This is kind of a unique episode in terms of season 2 because it's almost a part 2 to the previous episode, which was Child's Play. And at the end of that episode, the Autobots escape the child planet, they get into a little rocket ship, and then we find them. But it's not a 2-part. So how did all of this come about?
That was the Marvel story editor's idea. I don't believe it was mine at all, and I haven't gone back to look at the script, so I don't know if it was a note they gave me and I included it in the original draft, or a note they gave me for the second draft, or they decided on their own when they finally did the last version of their rewrite to add it into it. I actually have to go back and read the script and see if it was there originally.
Right, okay. And what's sort of interesting about that you're saying about the editor is the fact that pretty much for season 2 episodes, they were all very much standalone, weren't they?
Yes.
Season 1 had somewhat of an overarching plot, as did season 3 to some degree. But season 2 was very much just, we need 65 episodes for syndication.
Because in season 1, we didn't do, maybe it was just a mini-series?
Yeah.
It definitely wasn't 65. So in season 2, when it expanded to 65, we had a very narrow window to complete production, from writing the scripts to getting them on the air, and a buttload of writers that we needed to assign stories to. And so they were all focused on, and most of them were freelancers. Obviously, I wrote this one as a freelancer, but that was when Marvel was handling everything, before Sunbow opened an office in Los Angeles and then hired me on staff. So we had to, we did some in-house, as many as we could, but we had to hire a lot of freelance writers to work on the other scripts, and they were pretty much working all at the same time and not really knowing very much about what other writers were doing.
Right, okay.
And also, there was just no way to guarantee that the shows would air in any kind of order that they were written in, so that precluded the idea of having a through line.
Yeah. Okay. Now, this episode has somewhat of a unique history because the premise of it was originally used for a GoBots episode, wasn't it?
Yes. I will admit that when I got this assignment, I was relatively new to writing animation in general, but I really didn't get the Transformers at all. And I had written one GoBots just prior to it, and the story editors had rewritten it enough that I didn't recognize the episode. And so when I put together all my premises to pitch to Marvel, and what I often do is I'll end up being one short for the minimum that they want, and I'll come up with a throwaway idea that I haven't given a lot of thought to. So I threw in the exact same premise I wrote for GoBots for Transformers, and that's the one which always happens to me. They go with the throwaway idea, and this is the one that they pick. But yeah, it was a show I didn't understand Transformers, and I didn't really get the show, even though I read the Writer's Bible and I'd seen the miniseries.
So right now, just to go back to the episode, is everybody reading Void Rivals at the minute? Yeah? Spoiler alert! Bosch has just showed back up in the comics after like 30 years or something, which is great. And you posted that on Facebook.
Yeah, I thought it was, I know he name drops Lizardo a few issues back.
He's in it as well.
Oh, is he?
Lizardo. Yeah, absolutely.
That's great.
Yeah. So that must feel really rewarding, knowing that the characters are still remembered fondly.
It's pretty thrilling to know that Robert Kirkman is a fan of something that I, again, didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was making it up as I went along. The idea that DevCon even exists was because nobody told me that I could create my own Transformers, or that I couldn't create my own Transformers. So, because I made him a bounty hunter, and I went through the list of all the Autobots and all the Decepticons, I didn't find a character that I felt worked. I just made up a new Transformers.
On this was our lesson. Yeah. Funnily enough, with Slazaro, you obviously created him for this episode.
Yes.
He would famously show up again in another episode in season 3, which you didn't want.
I didn't. That was Paul Davis, who worked as a production coordinator at Marvel Productions, and desperately wanted to write for the show. So I think he wrote at least 2 episodes, maybe even 3.
Yeah.
And I have even though I was producer on the show, I have no memory of that particular episode that he wrote.
Yeah.
And if Lizardo ever made another appearance.
Yeah, so it was the episode of Grimlock's New Brain where he showed up. And I always wondered about that because obviously this is a character that you've made, and I knew with you being the producer on season 3, I was wondering if it was, the script called for a character perhaps to be there as an accomplice or something like that in the episode, and you might have looked over that and just said, it's Lizardo.
I'd like to say that's true, but
Yeah,
I have no memory of that.
If you say it's true, everybody believes you. And here we have Lord Gaggedy now, Let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
Has anybody read Flint Dille's autobiography? Yeah, okay. So, go for it. Tell us about Lord Gaikin.
alright. So one trick in writing for animation, when you're creating characters' names, is just kind of either do a mashup or just do a little twist on a common name. So Lizardo was easy because he was a sleazy wizard. With Gaikin, Flint and I were friends before we worked together at Sunbow. And around the time that I was writing this script as a freelancer, Flint and Gary Gygax had become friends, and they were working on a book project called Sagar.
Yeah, I think
Something
like that. Yeah.
Which was a choose your own adventure kind of book. And so Flint was spending a lot of time at Gary Gygax was renting this mansion, top of Beverly Hills, overlooking the Beverly Hills Hotel, that once was owned by a very famous film director named King Beaver, who had horses on his property. So the old stable was converted into kind of a game room and offices. So Flint was writing Sagar in one office, I was writing this script in another office. And so when it came time for this Gaikin character, I combined Gary Gygax's name with another friend that Flint and I have in common named David Marconi, who is a writer-director and most famous for writing the movie Enemy of the State. So his name was supposed to be pronounced Lord Gaikin, or excuse me, now I'm getting it wrong, Lord Gaikoni. And what I didn't know at the time, and this was a learning lesson for me, was that in the script, I needed to spell out phonetically how something from the person's name should be pronounced, so that it wouldn't screw it up in the recording session. Now, once I was hired at Sunbow as a producer, I supervised all the recording sessions. So I was in the booth with the director during all the episodes. So anytime there was an issue with pronunciation, or even if a line didn't work, I would be there to rewrite the line or give the correct pronunciation or something. So, but yeah, the first time I saw it, I heard Lord Gaikin. What the hell is that?
And we've just had DevCon make his appearance in the episode. So you mentioned there about the fact that you needed a bounty hunter. And so how much freedom did you have from like Hasbro oversight and Sunbow oversight in terms of what you were able to do in these episodes? Because now, I imagine, if you try to write an animation episode and just make a character up, the lawyers would be down on you in no time.
I would imagine that too. And again, because I was a freelancer and Marvel was handling the story editing duties, I didn't have a lot of direct information about what Hasbro liked and didn't like. And it really came down to the simple fact that nobody told me that I couldn't make up my own Transformers. So once I was at Sunbow, and I'm getting faxes from Hasbro about new characters that they wanted to see, there still wasn't a lot of direction from them. They never dictated any kind of story ideas that they wanted us to write. The only thing that was important to them was every time they would come out with a new line of characters, I would get a fax from them and they would say, with the model sheet, character description, that they wanted to start including those characters in the scripts so the air dates would coincide with when the toys would be on the shelves.
And you know, you talk there about requests that Hasbro made. Obviously, this being the spotlight episode really for the character of Smokescreen, and this is sort of his big outing. What was it about the character of Smokescreen that you thought lent itself well to this episode, or was it just, I have an idea, they need Smokescreen, I'll just pop them in?
Well, again, it comes back to my being clueless about these characters. So I really didn't fully appreciate any of the characters. So I literally just went down the list and just picked different characters either because I liked their name. And I think Smokescreen because he was a race car.
Yeah.
And that really was it. And I had no idea that it ended up meaning a lot to a lot of the fans, because I guess he didn't appear in a number of episodes very often.
Yeah, he was there in season 2, but you know, this is really his defining outside of seeing
Yeah, so it was really just, you know, stupid luck.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of why this episode is so well regarded by fans, because one, it is a Smokescreen episode who certainly has a fan base, but obviously you introduce DevCon and you introduce all of these alien characters who would appear in later seasons and later comics and things like that. And it's quite unique because it, as you say, within the first 2 minutes of the episode, you've shelved basically the vast majority of the main cast. And the Decepticons don't really appear until Act 2, and I think this is, what, maybe one of 2 episodes where Megatron doesn't appear at all?
Yeah, and again, I think it's because I don't think I knew how to write for Megatron, so I just said, well, I'm not even going to include him.
Yeah. So, with this being an episode, which is such a weird thing to say, but it's an episode that revolves around gambling. And, you know, that is the crux of it. It's a gambling planet, all of that stuff. We see people fighting here over placing bets and things like that. How much freedom did the Reagan relaxing of restrictions on animation play in terms of your writing of this episode? Because if people don't know, you know, famously a few years earlier, Scooby-Doo couldn't have crosses in a graveyard because of the restrictions that were placed on writers. So, did you write much pre-regulation?
No, I didn't start writing animation until, less than a year before I wrote this.
So
in '84 is when I first stumbled into animation writing.
right, okay, yeah. Because it's always such a funny one, you know, between this, there's another episode in season 2 where the Decepticons essentially pretend to be gods to aliens, you know, a group of aliens and things like that. And these are themes which today might seem commonplace as storytelling, but for children's animation, it's certainly unique for the time. Even if you did manage to get it into an episode of Robots before that. So we're coming to the end of the episode with Act 3. In terms of this particular episode, one other thing that strikes me is this is going to be super nerd, and I'm really sorry. And you're going to just be like, shut up. But you insinuate that Megatron's running a Universal International Gambling Syndicate in this episode. Is it true? And if so, is Megatron going to break your legs if you don't make payment?
In hindsight, I would say yes and yes.
I don't know the guy, but he sounds bad. Yeah. And so how many revisions would an episode like this normally go under when you're writing this?
Start with the premise, then go to outline. Premise usually about a page long. Outline would be 12 to 15 pages. Have a week between getting the premise approved and turning in the outline. And then once that's approved, then go to script. I think 2 weeks is your deadline. And then get notes on the first draft, a week to rewrite, turn in the second draft, and then if the story editors felt it needed a little more polishing, they would do it themselves. So I'd spend a month between when I first submitted the premise to turning in the final draft.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people get surprised when they hear about how quickly these episodes were turned around. And I'm sure you'll talk more about this with Jim later on when we're talking about the behind the scenes. But, there'll probably be some gasps in the audience. If people look back at this and they say, oh, the animation's a little bit ropey, or there's an animation error here, or this character's recolored wrong here, or something, it's literally because sometimes you would finish the script, submit that, and the animation would be done in as little as like 4 months and that was the deadline we were working off. Now it's 2 years for an animation series.
Yeah.
And you were doing this in 5 months with the month you took for writing?
And 65 shows, yeah.
Yeah, it was just absolutely great.
Yeah, so every Friday I would send a script to Marvel for them to sign to storyboard artists on Friday nights. It started over the weekend. And I think I was probably going to recording sessions like 2-3 times a week.
Yeah. Oh, where are we? Oh yes, the Autobots are about to be saved. So you're doing this, you're writing it and things like that. Now with DevCon, what's interesting, you were talking to me about this last night, and it's a question that was asked of you at another convention, but it's a good one, which is why didn't DevCon show again?
Yeah, completely my foolish mistake. Because I considered him a throwaway character, and he really only has, 3 scenes? 4 scenes? And because he wasn't part of the toy line, once I got to Sunbow and had more involvement in the series and all of the episodes, it simply never occurred to me to bring him back. And I easily could have, in any of the other episodes or premises I pitched, I could have written another DevCon story, but it just never thought of it.
And are you aware of what the character's done in the last 40 years, in terms of...
Well, that's the other thing. I was completely unaware that he had become a thing. I had no idea that there was any fan base for him whatsoever.
Yeah. It was sort of a funny one, because he really sort of came back into public consciousness, I'd say, like in the early 2000s. He would appear in cameos, background shots and stuff. Clearly, fans of the show were just putting him in. The story didn't necessarily call for him. But then, as of last year, was it last year? When did we get that new DevCon toy? Last year?
It was just last year.
Yeah, absolutely. That must have been a thrill for you.
It
like
was.
40 years, almost 40 years.
I went to my very first Transformer convention that I was invited to a year ago, July, in TF.Con Toronto. And I arrived late on a Friday night, and the first thing someone tells me is that Hasbro has released a DevCon figure, and then a member of the staff gifted me one the next morning, and I just never believed that Hasbro would ever acknowledge his existence because they didn't create it. So it was very thrilling.
We've just missed, actually, DevCon's just left the episode with Lizardo. And I'm telling you, if there's a buddy cop show that I want to watch, it is that, it's great. And that brings us nicely towards the end of the episode.
If you don't mind me promoting another convention that I'm going to.
Go on.
I was invited to what I believe to be a small convention in Winnipeg, Canada, not long after I get back from here. And they had a poster made to look like a comic book that features DevCon as Lizardo. And it looks pretty cool. So, EnterCon, if you want to go online and look at the poster.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that brings us nicely to the end of the episode. You mentioned there about, finding it difficult sometimes to go back and watch these. Overall, now 40 years later, what's your take on the Gamma?
I'm still a little embarrassed by it. Because to me, it's so obvious I didn't know what I was doing. But I am proud of the happy accidents that sort of came out of that. And that is the creation of DevCon and Lizardo. and now thanks to Robert Kirkman, Bosch. And I'm also proud of the fact that I created Bosch before Michael Connelly created Bosch for his books and now the TV series.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was that. Round of applause for that episode. The next episode is now we're going to watch one of my all-time favourite Transformers episodes, which is The Burden Hearts to Bear. It's funny, we here in the UK, we've got so little in terms of Transformers. Who's old enough to remember when we watched Transformers on TV? Yes. When we used to get like 5 minutes a day. We never got past More Than Meets the Eye in the 6-week holiday. It was dreadful. So an awful lot of these episodes were completely missing from us. And I'm not going to suggest that in the early 2000s, thanks to the wonders that were LimeWire, I might have very slowly got all of these. That's a really dated reference for people if you will. But I came across this episode much later in life, and even as a fully grown adult, I was absolutely blown away by this episode because it ties a bow into Rodimus' story, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But tell us, this is the second to last episode you would write, Return of Optimus Prime being the final one. How do you feel, based on what you said at the end of the Gambler about being a little embarrassed by writing, how do you feel your writing improved by the time you got to this point?
Well, clearly I understood the show and the characters better. I don't know if the quality of writing is any better, but this is my favorite episode of all the ones that I wrote.
Okay.
And it's just primarily because of the whole idea of dealing with the Japanese samurai code of honor, and the whole story takes place in Japan. I try to be respectful of the culture, and even that early scene, I was, the Japanese are famous for their city stomping movies, so I was paying tribute to that as well, when you see the big robots in the water and the fishing boats.
I was going to ask about that because, yeah, right at the beginning, yeah, it is, if you love Combiners, like it is Combiner City Central. And you know what, I never put two and two together, that was what you were going for. So basically, Godzilla,
yeah,
sort of, all of that, yeah. So, at this point, you are on staff now. You're working as a producer on the show.
Oh yeah, I had written for a while.
Okay.
The first episode I wrote, once I was on staff, was Starscream's Brigade.
Yeah. So, you and your team famously kill Optimus Prime in Transformers the movie. And then you're going to bring them back at the end of this season. But I'm guessing there was a period of time where the Return of Optimus Prime wasn't going to be the end of season 3 because Optimus Prime was dead. And this episode really feels like it finally brings closure to Rodimus' story, which is the young, impulsive, hot-headed hero who's not sure he wants to be in charge, and he's giving the Matrix away to a zombie at one point, which, to be honest, is never a good idea. Was your intention when you wrote this episode to bring his story to a close? Was that the impetus for this episode?
Not so much to a close, but I was fascinated by his character. And sometimes when, for me, in writing an episode, I come at it from different angles, and sometimes it's just a macro verse, and I'm not thinking about characters specifically, but in this case, it was him specifically that I wanted to build an episode around. And even though when I wrote it, I was much older than what he was supposed to be, I still could relate to that crisis of identity that he was having, and this burden he now had thrust upon him. So I just wanted to explore that idea, and then I was able to work in, my affinity for Bushido, the code of the samurai warrior, and just throw And yes, we still had empty slots to fill for the end of the season. So at the time I wrote this, we were not thinking about Return of Optimus Prime.
Yeah. Because in one sense, it's a lot of people now, mistakenly think that Dark Awakening is the final episode because they rigged up the ending to say Optimus Prime is coming back after you kill him and then famously kill him again. But obviously no, this was the last production episode before the end of the season. And so it nicely brings it to a close, but then obviously Optimus Prime comes back in the next episode and suddenly he's back to square one again. So you were talking there about your affinity for Japanese culture and Bushido and things. So where does that come from for you personally?
Just something I'd always been fascinated by samurai films. I was a huge Kurosawa fan, and I just started. I stumbled in a used bookstore on a book called Hagakure, which is a book about the code about Bushido and the code of I think it's called The Way of the Samurai. And I don't know, I just understood it, related to it, and thought it was kind of an interesting way to live your life. And I felt like it would work in this kind of story to play that out.
So here, just if you're too busy listening to us talking, so Rodimus has just crashed, and the Matrix has fallen out, and the Decepticons are about to steal the Matrix. And again, super nerdy question, I know, but what was your take on the Matrix? Because it was kind of very obscure in season 3 as to exactly what it was. Much later on, the writers would come along and try and clarify what it was. It would be the wisdom of the ancients, things like that. But when you were writing this and you were using the Matrix as sort of the MacGuffin for this episode, what was your take on it?
I didn't really have much of a take. I was trying to work with whatever we had done before, even though I didn't quite understand it, and it seemed like we maybe had different writers had slightly different takes on it, and so I was just kind of bluffing my way through it. And of course, I was well aware of what Flint, even though I don't think the film had been released yet, but I was certainly well aware of what Flint was doing for the feature.
Yeah, so the movie would have come out by then, but obviously by the time you were in production for this, it wouldn't have been out. And yeah, I mean, even in Transformers the movie, the Matrix is just the thing that's going to kill Unicron at the end of it. And it's really not until season 3, but then we have, forgive me again, I won't get seriously nerdy, but we have episodes like Call of the Primitives, which has the introduction of where Unicron comes from in the cartoon, and the Matrix. And one of our biggest pet peeves in the fandom is that we don't have the original script yet for Call of the Primitives, and there's a scene in that which sort of explains where the Matrix comes from, but it doesn't really, and we're desperate to read it to find out what is actually going on in that scene. So I always wondered if it was just treated amongst the writers as just, it's just a MacGuffin, or whether you had a concrete vision for it.
It kind of was. And for the script that you're talking about, it could have been one of two things happening. It was either that particular writer's take on what he felt it was or should be, or whoever was working as a story editor at the time. I don't know. At some point, Roger Slifer came on because Flint was busy with the movie, and so Roger may have rewritten his version of The Matrix.
And this episode also, we're seeing it here, so Scourge, Galvatron wants to just throw the Matrix in the bin because he got scared by a couple of ghosts. Quite rightly so as well. But Scourge picks it up. Now, what's interesting about that as an idea is that Scourge throughout season 3 doesn't really do anything. He's just the other henchman of Galvatron. Cyclonus gets a standalone episode. in the Killing Jar, which is very early on in season 3. And Cyclonus has a sort of well-developed honor sort of sense of loyalty and things like that. Scourge doesn't really do anything, he's just a henchman and the sweeps are just there to get blown up. Again, was there any impetus for giving Scourge the Matrix in the episode over anybody else?
I think, I don't remember. My guess is that he was a character I hadn't written before.
Okay.
And so instead of me going back to the well and using the same character, I thought, oh, well, let's make that Scourge this time.
And so just like literally, I haven't played with this character yet.
Yeah.
And so now Rodimus is obviously back to being Hot Rod, and he's about to go on his journey, I suppose, to rediscovering his, what he needs to be in order to be a leader. Do you feel that, I don't know if you're aware, but are you aware of some of the feelings that people have towards Hot Rod as a character?
Yes.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
and I don't object to them at all. But I'd like to think if they saw this episode, they might feel slightly different about it. But when at conventions, when people come up and talk to me, very few want to talk about this particular episode. So I just assumed it wasn't a fan favorite.
I just wonder if it is because it was so latter-day season 3. There's a lot of people who haven't perhaps seen it. I mentioned obviously earlier about the fact that we never got this in the UK until it got released on DVD, about 20 years ago or something like that. So when you're working on this in terms of being a producer on the show and you're turning in a script as well, how does that change the relationship and the dynamic that you have behind the scenes when it's a piece of work that you're doing? Are you handing that off to somebody else to story edit, or are you doing that yourself? Or?
There's still an official story editor, but like when it was Flint, our offices shared a common wall, and so unless there was something egregious that I had committed, whatever changes he would make would be just enough to justify the fact that he's a story editor. So they'd be really minor things. And even when Roger came on board for a few months while Flint was in New York working on the script, there were no, long, protracted disputes about, how to tell the story. And although I do recall, and I don't know which script it was, where I was very frustrated with Roger because he would always say, well, I have a lot of problems with this. And so I nicknamed him Roger, I have a lot of problems, but no solutions. Because I'm one of those writers who, if I see a problem in the script, I try to come up with a solution for it that resolves it. And so it's frustrating to me when somebody says, oh, I don't like this, I don't think it works. Well, what is it about it you don't like? And what can I do to fix it that you think would improve it, not just make it different? And they can't come up with anything that I feel like you shouldn't have that job.
Yeah, constructive criticism goes a long way, but as long as it is constructive as opposed to do better next time. Yeah, exactly. One thing that we saw there with Scourge was the fact that now that he has the Matrix, you've written sort of a body horror thing. He's become horribly disfigured and grotesque and twisted and things like that. What was the impetus for that in terms of the story?
Well, it's funny, when I watched this the other day and I saw, these bumps growing out of his skin, I think, did I write that? It's like, if I were doing it today, I had him mutate somehow, but visually that didn't work for me at all.
Yeah.
And I don't remember writing it that way, and again, I'll have to go back and look at the script and see if I actually did. And if I did, I'm sure when I was writing it, I thought it would be cool, but when I saw it, it was like, oh, that looks terrible. Because he didn't look, for me, he didn't look frightening enough or menacing enough as what I could have done with it.
And here we have Hot Rod with the sensei, and they introduced the concept of Giddy,
Yes.
pronounced Giddy, which translates as the burden hardest to bear.
Yeah.
I'm assuming then, as a fan of Japanese culture and history, this must have just been a great scene for you to plant.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I was dying to get to that scene. Now, the other thing I noticed the other day is it seems like there's a missing transition from the last time you see him, and like, you know, he runs away mad and doesn't want to talk to anyone, to him showing up and talking with the sensei. And again, I have to go back and see if it was something that I wrote and that for time got cut. But it bothers me that we don't see him pivot to the point where he feels like he's ready to have that conversation.
And, you know, when Rodimus is there and he's, the concept of Giddy is grown up and he's, you know, trying to understand his place, did you base that on any particular sort of legends of samurai culture or anything like that, or was that just a concept that you'd read and thought would apply nicely to the story?
I think it's all part of the classic storytelling of a hero's journey that I was just drawing from.
Which, would that be like somewhat different based on Japanese tradition compared to, say, the Western tradition?
That, in its simplest terms, I think it's pretty universal.
Okay, yeah. So we've got this fight scene going on where Scourge is getting progressively.
Another thing that bothered me.
Yeah.
Did I actually write that there's a guy running around the streets of Tokyo carrying a samurai sword? What the hell?
I mean, I was about to say it makes sense, but it really doesn't, does it? Now that you think about it?
Not to me.
No. I love these scenes as well that you have with Galvatron. Galvatron was such a fun character in season 3 because of his instabilities, shall we say. Was he a character that was fun to write, you know, just because he was so crazy compared to Megatron, for example, who seemed to be a lot more well-adjusted?
You know, I have very little memory of writing him into the script or writing him in any scripts in general. For some reason, he didn't make as much of an impression upon me. Like, obviously, Starscream was my favorite character, right? Because he's such a buffoon. But I didn't feel any specific attachment to Soundwave, so I'm not sure why I included him.
Yeah, it's just great because he just shows up, screams at Cyclonus a lot. And, you know, then you feel sorry for Cyclonus because he's just like, oh, it's got to put up with this guy. You know, and then they're off to, as you say, sort of, well, just mock Scourge once Hot Rod or Rodimus is finished with him now. And he's going to get the Matrix back, and look at that. Boom! When you look back at the animation footage, you know, sometimes in season 3, the animation is incredible. Then there's ACOM. And, you know, but sometimes you get episodes like this. Was it infuriating for you as a writer if you realised that the animation you were getting back just was a disservice to the story you were telling?
And I have a theory about this that's never been confirmed. Now, I don't know how Marvel decided which studio they were going to send which episode to. But my theory goes back to the storyboard. And for me, what I started noticing is the better quality of the storyboard, the better quality of the animation. So my theory was that if a less talented storyboard artist worked on the storyboards, when it got to whichever studio was assigned to it, they looked at the storyboard and said, well, if you guys don't care about it, we're not going to care about it. So we're not going to put our A team on it. Maybe we won't even put our B team on it. We put our C team on it.
And that nicely brings us to the end of this episode as well. A big round of applause for Phil Mark. And thank you to Michael for editing all of my nerdy questions for this particular episode. Michael, you'll be back with us in a couple of hours where you'll be joining Jim on stage with Mr. Greg Berger. Talking a lot more about the behind the scenes of Transformers, both from Greg's point of view as a voice acting talent and Michael as a production assistant and writer. So, again, a big round of applause for Michael.